Well, good morning, Bedrock Church. We are so excited to be back talking with you this morning and being together in community. We are here at Ferrum College, enjoying the rainy weather this morning.
Yeah, speaking of rainy weather, we've been talking about these uncommon things, inventions. And so today we have the umbrella, the humble umbrella. And so Ross, we were talking earlier, there was a point, I believe it was back in like the 1800s. I could be totally off on that, and that's fine. But there was a point in England when the idea of men embracing the idea of an umbrella was just unforeseen. It was very uncommon because they thought it looked so much like the parasol, which is something that the ladies would carry around to block the sun out, right? That the guys were so apprehensive about embracing that. But today, if you go to somewhere, especially like England, where there's so much rain, everybody has an umbrella. So again, I'm very grateful for the invention of the umbrella, especially on days like today.
Yes.
So yeah, we've been talking about the life of Joseph. We've been tracking through his story. I mean, what a crazy story, right? I mean, you think about, just the roller coaster of his life. I mean, from the favored son to being sold as a slave, to being raised up in Potiphar's house, to this accusation back in slavery, and then or in prison. And as he's in prison, there are these two guys that come to him. We talked about last week. And he interprets their dreams. And the one thing he says, right, to them is, don't forget about me. When Pharaoh raises you back up to the cupbearer, don't forget about me. And as we close out chapter 40, we see that, in fact, the cupbearer did forget about Joseph. And so he's kind of in this moment. And so as we turn the page today and start to look at chapter 41, there's a couple things we're going to notice. One, I just want to remind us of our bedrock principle we've been talking about, and that being trusting God when life doesn't make sense. And we see that so much throughout Joseph's life. So much of the things that he went through didn't make sense in the moment, but yet he continued to trust God in those things. And then for today, really kind of the big picture idea that we're going to be looking at is that God-given ability used to show God's story brings about God-sized results. And so what we're going to see in Joseph's life is that he takes something that God has given him as a gift, as an ability. He uses that not for his own purposes, right, but to tell really this foreign government, this foreign nation about this God of the Hebrews, Yahweh. And then because of that, God brings some incredible results through Joseph's life. Yeah. So that's kind of where we're going, Ross. So you're going to kind of take the lead on a lot of this today. So I'm going to turn it over to you and teach us for a little while.
Yeah, so we're going to be in Genesis chapter 41, if you want to be turning there. And we're going to be thinking about this idea of dreams today, because we've seen so far about how Joseph interprets dreams. He has his own dreams, and that will continue in this chapter as well. So we see that Joseph is gifted by God to take something like dreams that don't make sense and make their meaning seem obvious and seem like common sense. So the tying back into our theme of uncommon sense. So let's start in Genesis 41, just with that first verse there. It says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. So we see that Pharaoh is dreaming as well, and that would have been pretty common, that the Egyptians believed that dreams were a way the gods spoke to Pharaoh as the embodiment of the gods. And so actually Pharaohs kept a dream book where they would write down all of their dreams for later analysis. Archaeologists have found dream books, one that was written on papyrus dating from 1275 BC, the time of Ramses II, that contained 108 different dreams that this pharaoh had recorded for later analysis to figure out what was going on.
Pretty wild to read over that.
Yeah, what were these guys dreaming about? I mean, if you think about people, thousands of years from now reading your dreams, how you'd feel about that. So let's pick up now in chapter 41. Rustin, could you read verses 2 to 4?
Sure. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump. I'm just going to say right there, I've never seen an attractive cow, but I get what he's saying. And they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the banks of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows.
Yeah, so I think Pharaoh would have had an indication that this was significant. When you start studying Egypt, cows spark something in your memory immediately because so many of the gods were symbolized with cows. So, for example, Hathor was the goddess of motherhood and was symbolized as a cow. And then her son, Apis, was the son of Hathor and was symbolized as the god of fertility, also a cow. And so Pharaoh would have connected this immediately, I think.
Yeah, I guess in our culture too, we think about the role of cows play in our culture, even though they're this humble kind of farm animal.
Yeah.
We think about milk and cheese and dairy and how much that plays
There is a connection to life in some way.
Yeah, okay.
Right. All right, so let's keep going. Can you read 5 to 7?
Sure. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump ears, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream.
Now, you remember what we said about grain the other week?
Oh yeah, it was really big because they were for what was it, for beer and for bread, right? That was the big thing in Egypt.
So again, this would have been startling to Pharaoh, of like, oh no, something's going to happen to the grain. Like, that's really going to mess things up.
Sure.
So 2 dreams like this really startles him, and so now he's going to get people to talk to him about it. So in verse 8, it says, "So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh." Dream interpretation was an important job in the royal court. You would have diviners, people whose sole job was it to interpret these dreams to see what the gods were trying to say to Pharaoh. And they were actually on the same level as like a physician. You'd have the doctors come in to deal with something, and then you'd have the diviners come in, and the spiritual and medical connection between the two to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, I think it's important too to note that he was troubled in his spirit. Like there was, probably being these were such important assets to him. Both the cows and the grain, that he woke up. It would be like waking up, but he didn't know what that meant. He was just like, something's not right. What does this mean?
Yeah, for sure. The other thing about dreams that's kind of cool is that we see that the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, speaks through dreams, often through Scripture. I was doing some research and looking through this. There are 21 dreams recorded in the Bible, 10 of which happen in Genesis, 1 in Judges, 1 in 1 Kings, 3 are in Daniel, and 6 in the book of Matthew. 6 of the 10 dreams in Genesis are interpreted by Joseph, that he is the main one in Genesis, 6 of those 10. And then kind of, I don't know what the connection is if you want to make that, but in Matthew, 4 of the 6 dreams are for Joseph, Jesus' father, as well. Again, I don't know what kind of like conspiracy theory or connections you want to make, but I just thought that was interesting. I also thought it was cool that these dreams, the 21, most of these are not to God's people, which is kind of crazy. So like you see Abimelech is a Philistine, and he receives a dream. Laban is Aramean. Pharaoh is Egyptian. Nebuchadnezzar is Babylonian. The 3 magi are Persian probably. And Pilate's wife is Roman. And so it seems like God uses this as a means to communicate with people that otherwise wouldn't listen to him.
Outside of God's people, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of crazy.
That is cool.
And through these dreams, which are distinct from visions versus waking versus sleeping, God makes his plans clear to these people about what his plan is going to be. So let's pick up back in verse 9 and go to 13.
Okay. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, who's the guy who forgot Joseph,
Right.
"I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving us an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged."
Yeah, so the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph.
He kind of has this aha moment, like, oh yeah, that guy. I forgot all about him.
Which kind of makes you think, like, of the timing of God's sovereignty in this. Like, would Pharaoh have cared that there was a Hebrew who knew dreams if the cupbearer had remembered? If he had come out and said, hey, there's this kid that can interpret dreams, would Pharaoh have cared if he had not needed it at that point?
There's this moment, right, for such a time as this, that was sparked in his mind.
That's kind of what we see in the life of Joseph, is there's these things that seem like God doesn't hear him or isn't there or isn't involved, but there's just such sovereign timing that God sees a bigger picture on that.
That's great.
Great. Then we get to verse 14, where it says, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. So we see this reclaiming of his status, that he is starting to come back to where he was in the house of Pharaoh. Can you read 15 and 16, please?
Yeah. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that you hear a dream and can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer.
And I just love Joseph's response to that.
Yeah, how easy would it have been for him to be like, yeah, I'm the guy. I'm the man. Like, tell me your dream. Like, and then what's in it for me? But he doesn't look at this gift that God's given to him for his own purposes, but he takes it and says, there is a God, and he will give you the interpretation.
Yeah, I think of my own reaction, or maybe you can think of your own reaction. If you were called into a government office to give testimony or to do something that you were skilled at, how would you react? And I think there's two sides, and yet Joseph finds a third. Do you act with pride and say, yes, I can do this, I know exactly what to do? Or do you act with humility and say, no, please don't pick me, I'm not worthy to do this? Mm-hmm. But Joseph finds a third option where he says, it's not me, it's God that's going to do it.
Yeah, that's good.
Joseph redirects Pharaoh's attention away from himself to the true source of power. And I think that comes about because Joseph knows what his message is, that it's all about God, no matter what. That no matter what he does, God will get the glory. And then he can see that God has a plan for his life, and he is just the instrument for other people to believe who God is. So we want to take a minute and kind of discuss this and think about this. When you're given praise for something, how do you react? And how can we use our gifts to point people to God like Joseph does? So take a minute in your groups and let's discuss this question.
All right, so as we come back, we're going to keep tracking through the story. And so in verses 17 through 24, basically it's just a retelling of Pharaoh's dream. So again, that idea that there were these plump cows, 7 plump cows, and these skinny, ugly cows, and the skinny ones consumed the plump ones. And then the same thing with grain. There were these good-looking ears, and then there were these really thin, weather-beaten ears, and the thin ones consumed the plump ones. And so now we're going to get into the part right where Joseph starts to give Pharaoh some understanding of what this means.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you could read 25, 27.
Sure. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine.
Yeah, so just kind of to sum that up, right, the 7 responds to years. So we see the good, plump, attractive things, the cows and the wheat, are that there's going to be good years of food, and then the withered, skinny ones are going to be 7 years of famine, right? He's just reinforcing it by giving him 2 dreams. And again, Joseph gives God the credit. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do, and then invites Pharaoh in to see the goodness of God and how he's going to provide a way out of that. Okay? So let's go ahead and read 28 to 32, kind of a bigger chunk here.
Sure. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. I love that he's giving God the credit again there. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that this thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about.
Yeah, so when we hear Joseph's interpretation, something really struck me this week. If you listen to what he's saying, remember that Joseph is the message and not just the messenger. and that Joseph's interpretation is the story of God's plan for redemption. Right? If you think about it, it says there will be this time of plenty, that the world will be bountiful at the start, kind of like Eden, but then there will be a fall, that the world will fall into chaos, that there will be this famine, but God will provide a way out. And more importantly, Joseph said he will provide it through the salvation through one man. Like Joseph's setting up this gospel story in the mind of Pharaoh before really that's even established.
Yeah.
Before we get the law and all of that.
Cool. Yeah.
So God will provide a way out, and so he starts to explain how that's going to go about. So let's read 33 to 37.
Okay. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so the land may not perish through the famine.
Yeah, and so not only do we see Joseph interpret Pharaoh's dream, but then gives advice. Like I love Joseph how there is this balance of like giving God the glory, but also this presumption of taking action. Like, here's what you should do.
Right. He doesn't just sit back and kind of say, well, here's the interpretation, you do what you want to. Like, he also takes that gift that God's given to him and uses that in a really, really helpful way.
Yeah, turns it into leadership and not just this passiveness. Yeah. And so 38, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom the Spirit of God? I love how Pharaoh immediately jumps on board. Like, all right, let's do this. That's a great plan.
It's like Pharaoh sees in Joseph the same thing that Potiphar, the same thing, the guy in jail. Like, they don't just see Joseph, they see God at work. Can we find another man who has the Spirit of God?
And I like to imagine that these other people that couldn't interpret the dream are just standing there, like
really
awkwardly looking like, I mean, whatever.
They don't have much job security in this
right. And then I feel like 39 is a little sassy. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. Like, all these guys are still in the room.
Right.
But there he goes. So in verse 40 it says, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you.
How much is that echoing Potiphar language that we just heard?
Like, that's not much left. Like, just the throne, the ultimate power.
Like, you're not over me, but everything else.
Yeah. And in a sense, too, I mean, I don't know how much this connection means to you guys, but it seems almost like what God told Adam, too. Like, everything is under your dominion besides the ultimate authority.
Right.
We see, again, that picture.
Which is really the knowledge of good and evil. That was the one thing in the garden that God reserved that he would have, and yet that was the one thing that he preserved. Yeah.
So I want to take a second, kind of back up and see if we can see the sovereignty of God in this moment. So when I was thinking about this, what if Joseph had gone from being a slave to then being second in command to Pharaoh? Would he have been prepared for that level of responsibility? Or did he gain experience from running Potiphar's house and running a prison to then be able to work under Pharaoh and have that much responsibility? That yes, he has a gift, but there's also God's sovereignty in preparing him for something bigger. So I'm not saying that God causes pain in our lives. What I am saying is God doesn't waste it either, that it's used as an opportunity to prepare us for something bigger.
Yeah, I think about like the 2 years that he just spent in prison, feeling like he was forgotten, because he really was by the cupbearer. But yet, how much was God able to use in Joseph's heart to humble him, so that when he would raise him up to this position, that he wasn't prideful like Adam was and trying to seek those things, but yet he still gave God the credit. How much did he learn in that moment, going through that? And yeah, I think that's so key to see in the story.
So what about you guys? Let's take some time to think about that. Can you think of an example where you saw God using a negative situation ultimately to grow you and to benefit you, and ultimately to benefit God as well? So take some time, share with your group of an example where you saw God using a negative situation to ultimately benefit you. right, so we are back. Let's continue looking at this blessing that Pharaoh is giving to Joseph. So we are picking up in verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I've set you over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain about his neck. We see yet again this restoration. The coat comes back one more time.
Right, yeah, and he doesn't lose it this time.
Right. Yeah, and then we get that signet ring, which is so important in the ancient world. If you had the ring of the official, you were basically signing in that person's name. You would stamp it in wax on a letter, and it's in that person's authority.
Yeah, that's actually the same imagery language that's used in Genesis when it talks about us being made in the image of God. It's that signet ring of like being dipped into the wax. And that would have been exact imprint, an exact, the representation of God.
Yeah, so Joseph basically has the authority to do what Pharaoh would have done if he was there, like just stamping with the Pharaoh's authority.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. All right, so verse 43 says, "And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, 'Bow the knee.' Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt.'" Right, we just see that continued blessing on Joseph's life, that God honors humble obedience to the fullest extent. In verse 45, "And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On." So there's actually much debate about what Joseph's new name means. I got kind of down a rabbit hole looking up stuff about it this week. But it depends on whether it is a Hebrew name, an Egyptian name, or a Coptic, which is like the Egyptian slang. So like Coptic is people don't speak in hieroglyphics. They speak like a slang.
Yeah.
So depending on whether you think Pharaoh gave him a new Hebrew name or a new Egyptian name changes the meaning, which is kind of interesting. But they all point to this favor that's given to Joseph. So it could either mean revealer of mysteries, because he interprets the dreams, or God speaks and he lives, showing Pharaoh's recognition of God's favor on Joseph. Or the coolest one to me is it could mean salvation of the age. Again, pointing to that, like that Joseph is a Christ type.
Yeah, that
pointing
type,
to
that
something
image.
to
Yeah,
that.
that's cool.
So that's kind of cool. But regardless, Pharaoh recognizes something in Joseph and gives him a new name that points other people to that they would know what his name is. So it's cool to see God's message being spoken regardless of language, right? That Pharaoh recognizes it and points it out. All right, so if you could read just 45 through 50 for us.
Yeah.
So starting with Joseph.
Yeah, so Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in the cities the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the seas, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, and I should have prepared better for these names. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him.
So just as a minor note, On was the name of a city, which would later be changed to Heliopolis when it's taken over by the Greeks, which refers to the fact that it was the sun god, Ra. So like Helio has to do with sun, the Greek. There was a big deal that there was this priest of this city that would be the hub for worshiping Ra, the sun god.
Okay.
All right, so let's continue at 51 to 52.
Okay. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all of my hardships and all of my father's house. Man, that's significant right there.
Yeah.
The name of the second son he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
I think it's cool that we see in these two names this reflection of aspects of God's character specifically to Joseph, but also like in the larger gospel story of Jesus. We have putting the past behind us in the sense of forgiveness, for God has made me forget all my hardships in my father's house. But then also this idea of giving hope in new life, in redemption, for the second name, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
That's cool.
Like this picture of the cross and the resurrection, of this death to our past and a new life in the future.
Yeah, and we think about, we talked about way back in the series about Leah when she was naming her sons based on what God had done in her life. And again, we see that play out in Joseph's life, these significant names.
So that's really cool.
Yeah.
So we see this parallel lesson that God's putting on display through Joseph throughout Egypt. Right? We see that Egypt went from being exalted to being humbled with this famine. But Joseph goes from being humbled in prison to being exalted to a higher position. This upside-down kingdom that we love to see, God loves to put in play to flip the world on its head. Right? In Matthew 23:12, Jesus says, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted." That upside-down kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so key.
All right, let's kind of wrap up the story here. So
Sure.
Go ahead from 53 to 57.
To the end. All right, here we go. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. Here we go. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." And what powerful language right there.
Well, and I just kind of connected that. It's like people go to Pharaoh looking for life, and he says, "No, go to Joseph."
Yeah.
Like, what a picture of the gospel.
And when you go to Joseph, who does he say? Like to Pharaoh, he says, it's really God. God's the one that will give you the interpretation. Cool. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the was severe over all the earth.
Yeah, and like the cool thing about this whole story of Joseph is the story could have ended here, right? We see this redemption of Joseph. He's brought to status. He's recognized by Pharaoh. He's given God the glory. But we see that it doesn't end here, that God has provided for Joseph, but God's plan is always bigger than just our own redemption, that he has a heart for his people and for the rest of the world, that there would be this picture of redemption for all. And that's what we're going to see next week.
Yeah, I also love just at the very end of verse 57 where it says that that people from all over the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy. And it's like yes, they came to purchase that, but ultimately I see that fulfillment or part of that promise that God made to Abraham, not just to be a blessing to his people, but ultimately to the whole world.
Right.
And we're starting to see the beginnings of this in the story of Joseph, that they're all coming to him for this blessing, for this food that they need.
Yeah.
So going back to this phrase we started out with today, God-given ability used to show God's story will bring about God-sized results. You know, as we think about that, Ross, I mean, that's really where the application comes home. How easy, as we've already mentioned, would it have been for Joseph just to take all the credit, right? I mean, he's the one with the gift to be able to interpret the dream. And Joseph could have taken that and used that to somehow prop himself up. But I think what we see in Joseph's life, and we've seen this throughout the story, but I think it's just highlighted so beautifully here, is that Joseph chooses humility. That's the uncommon response, right? I think the common response for just about everybody else in that position would be like, yeah, I'm the man. I can interpret this dream for you, Pharaoh. I'm your guy. And then use that to kind of prop themselves up.
Seizing that political opportunity.
Yeah, but instead, Joseph seeks humility, through humility, to give God the credit for it, and then God actually raises Joseph up. And I love that picture. I want to drive our attention back to a verse that you mentioned a minute ago, and that's in Matthew 23, verse 12. And this is really, for us today, I think, the take-home for us to think about in our lives. Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says this in verse 12, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." You know, and that's exactly what we see in Joseph's life. Those that put themselves in a position to raise themselves up, typically at some point will be humbled by that. But those that come humbly in this upside down kingdom that Jesus is talking about, those are the ones that ultimately God is going to raise up. And I think that's interesting. You know, when we put our trust in God and we trust Him I can, in humility, make it not about me, not about what I can get out of the situation, not about my own ability, but ultimately I can see situations and opportunities in life as a opportunity to share God's story. And that's exactly what we see with Joseph.
I think it comes from recognizing that none of it is ours. Like the things that,
right.
I think it's easy sometimes for us to say, oh, like this stuff is not mine, that it's given to me by God.
Right.
I think it's sometimes harder for us to say this thing I'm good at is not
that
mine.
Ability? Yeah.
And that ultimately comes from God as well. And once we get to that point of realizing that, it's so much easier to give it away.
Right. And when we do, right, God then uses our lives to share His story. And ultimately, as it says here, we will be exalted in that. Now, I think we need a little bit of definition. Those God-sized results that we see sometimes, that doesn't always mean prosperity and wealth. I think that's a very common thought in our world today, in the Christian culture today, that if you're just obedient to God, God's going to bless you and make you rich and all this sort of stuff. That's not at all what that means, but it means that God's ultimately going to use your life for purpose and value. It may mean, as we've seen throughout Christian history, of someone losing their life. The fuel of the gospel has been the blood of the martyrs throughout church history. And we would look back at their lives and say, did that turn out well from an earthly perspective for them? Probably not, the way we would define that. But yet, when we look at God using them in a great way, we say, man, that was the fuel to spread the gospel. And so, how we want to challenge you today, how we want to encourage you today, how we want you to respond is to think about your life and to ask the question, when I am in those situations, do I use that as an opportunity to exalt myself, or do I come into that with humility? I just want to read that passage one more time in Matthew 23:12. We're going to kind of close out with this. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Church, we love you. We're praying for you this week, and we really hope you take this and apply this to your life. And we will be back with you next week to talk more about the story of Joseph. Hope you have a good week. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.